Good afternoon, everybody. I expect that folks might be cycling in from the waiting room, so I'm going to give it maybe 15 seconds before we kick off. Okay, I count 15. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on nonprofits and good governance practices. I'm Jeff Moore, the Chief Strategy Officer at Independent Sector, and I am really excited today to be joined by two extraordinary thought leaders from Perlman Perlman, thought leaders in the space of good governance practices for nonprofits. Tracy Boak is partner, Courtney Davis, attorney, and I would also add that Perlman Perlman is an affinity partner to Independent Sector, so I'm especially delighted to be alongside of them today in this conversation. As I hope you know, Independent Sector is a national membership organization, and we're the only one that actually represents all the various parts and pieces of the nonprofit sector. So operating charities, philanthropy, corporate giving programs. And as you might expect, we therefore think a lot here at IS about public trust in nonprofits and philanthropy because we know that trust actually is the currency for our sector. You know, if you think about it, there is nothing that we do as nonprofits that without trust doesn't become harder or perhaps even impossible, right? So trust, again, is our currency. In 2 weeks, Independent Sector will be releasing our annual trust survey, which we conduct in partnership with Edelman Data and Intelligence. And that annual survey looks at a nationally representative sample of the American public, gauging public trust in nonprofits and in philanthropy. And without giving away the headlines of the report that we will be releasing on the 26th of September, and we'll be doing a webinar on the 27th of September about our findings, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But without giving away the headlines, let me just say that, maybe not surprising to you, we have a trust problem here in the sector. And so I share all of this because trust is the backdrop really to the conversation today. We know that one of the best ways to build trust in nonprofits and philanthropy is to make sure that nonprofit organizations are conducting their business in ways that are ethical, meet good governance standards, and are fully transparent. So today's webinar is intended to delve much deeper into what that in fact would look like in practice. And again, I'm just thrilled that we have both Courtney and Tracy to lead us through the conversation. But again, before I jump to the next slide, I mentioned that we will be doing a webinar on the trust survey. So please do look for more information from Independent Sector for that webinar, which will be happening on September 27th at 1 p.m. So I am going to turn us to the next slide and talk a little bit about there we go. What we're going to be covering today, what our speakers are going to be covering today. And we would expect, we would hope that you all are going to have questions for what you hear in today's conversation. So I'm going to the housekeeping, I'm going to encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, please drop your question into the Q&A box, and we will turn to questions at the end of today's conversation. So again, thank you for being with us, and let me turn this over to Courtney.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you to everyone at Independent Sector for inviting Tracy and me to speak to you today on behalf of our firm, Perlman Perlman. It's kind of an amazing moment to be here because the Independent Sector's Principles for Good Governance, I think, were one of the very first things I read when I started as a nonprofit lawyer many, many years ago. And their work has continued to be an ever relevant resource for me and I think for everyone in this sector. So particularly pleased to be here today. We have a jam-packed presentation for you, but before we start, we wanted to get a little sense of who is in the audience. So we have two quick polls that we're going to ask you to fill out just so we can get an idea of who we're talking to. So our first poll, which should be on your screen now, asks, if you currently work with a nonprofit organization, what is your role? So if you can just quickly click in, that's great. Thank you so much. We're seeing the results populating up as we go. Our focus today is going to be on governance, which has a lot to do with the interaction of boards and staff, but hopefully the content will be relevant regardless of the roles you play in the sector and affect whether you've ever been involved with a nonprofit before. So I hope you can all see the results here. Not surprisingly, we have about a third of our audience sits on a nonprofit board. Nearly half are on the staff of a nonprofit. 15% are outside advisors. 11% of you are overachievers who work with multiple nonprofits in various roles. And about 5% of you are here to learn, which is fantastic. And we hope that this presentation will help you get off on the right foot in your nonprofit work. Okay, very quickly, our second poll is going to ask about your experience with board meetings, if any. How much involvement have you had with nonprofit organization board and board meetings? So again, please just quickly click in. Oh, I don't know. Yeah. Is everyone able to see this? Yeah, I think the poll relaunched there briefly, so I apologize for the technical glitch. Please go ahead and click through if you have not done so already. Okay, it looks like we're about done. And so share the results. Okay, so it's an experienced group. Most people here have attended at least a few board meetings. Many people have attended several meetings, and almost 40% say it's basically their job to go to nonprofit board meetings. So regardless of your level of expertise, we hope that we'll have content today that will be of interest to you and give you a few nuggets maybe to take back and make your board meetings better. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy for our first content slide.
We're going to get rid of the polls there. Well, hi, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here, too. And like Courtney, I've been working with independent sector back since my days as a regulator, and was actually part of the NASCO experience in the first iteration of the good governance principles and use them in my practice now. So delighted to be here. I like to start off with this because I think people don't always necessarily have this understanding of literally how much nonprofit organizations are kind of under the microscope here. And when you think about who's watching them, and with the states, obviously we sort of have there in the middle is sort of the big one, because it all starts at the states. You get incorporated at the states. Your governance is primarily at the state level, but you're watched everywhere you go. And I think I've had interaction with all of these. We have the IRS and other federal agencies. I think states, people tend to think of the attorneys general, but as I've been involved in my practice, it's Secretary of State's, attorneys general, and then more and more frequently, I've been having interactions with the Franchise Tax Board, particularly in California, but in some other states as well. So it's really hard to escape eyes when you are working in the nonprofit sector. And now I turn it back to Courtney.
All right, just a moment of housekeeping. We've had a few folks asking about how the presentation will be shared afterwards for note-taking purposes. You will receive a recording of the presentation when this is done, so no need to panic. Okay, what is governance and why does it matter? Well, as Tracy just told you, nonprofits are being scrutinized at a number of different levels. That's one reason why it's relevant, but it's also relevant because it promotes the healthy functioning of nonprofit organizations. And so moving to our next slide, nonprofit governance is basically the practice of governing. It's the system, the policies, the practices, the processes by which a board of directors oversees and governs a nonprofit organization. Most nonprofits in the United States are formed as corporations, and therefore they're governed by boards of directors. Sort of if you think of the organizational hierarchy, the board would be at the top, overseeing the organization's work as a whole. How you form a new nonprofit? Generally, the organization incorporates under the laws of a particular state and then applies to the IRS to be recognized as tax exempt under federal law. So in the sector, you sometimes hear the word nonprofit, charity, foundation, tax exempt, C3, 501c3 organization. Those terms actually all have different meanings, but they're used fairly interchangeably. And there's a whole universe actually of tax exempt nonprofits out there. But for today's purposes, we're largely focusing on nonprofit corporations that have applied for and received tax exempt status under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. And we're focusing here because these are the kinds of organizations that most people think about when they think about nonprofits. They're formed for charitable purposes or educational purposes. They're schools, hospitals, churches, houses of worship, and environmental organizations, a whole range of different activities covered in this definition. So why is good governance so important? Well, one very important reason is because it helps to facilitate an organization's compliance with its legal obligations, right? Tracy and I clearly think that's very important. But beyond that, good governance practices help to facilitate the accomplishment of the organization's mission, which is probably the most important thing. They support the generally all volunteer board in carrying out their very important work, which, as we're going to talk about today, is no small undertaking. Serving on a nonprofit board entails a significant commitment of time, expertise, energy, and you're also often being tapped to support the organization financially. And so if you're going to give up your precious time, right, and energy to serve on a board as a volunteer, you want that time to be used as efficiently and effectively as possible. And good governance helps to promote that, which in turn makes it more likely that your organization is going to be able to attract the kind of talented people that you want to bring onto your board and retain. And then, overall, good governance strengthens your organization. It really is the foundation that everything else is built on. Organizations that have good governance practices are going to have other demonstrated signals of a healthy nonprofit. Whereas conversely, organizations that have poor or unsustainable governance practices are weaker, and in the worst cases, poor governance can foster an environment where abuse or illegal practices are more likely to occur.
Courtney, if I could just add something.
Go ahead.
I want to emphasize, I think based upon our audience, they probably know this because they're fairly experienced, but I do want to emphasize that good governance is not running the organization. You're at the higher level to sort of set the policy but the organization itself implements your policy and does the day-to-day running. If you're at a position where you as the board are having to step in and run the organization, your organization is having some problems. So I just want to sort of separate that out and make it clear that the good governance, you set the governance and you set the policy, but you're not actually then the one that has to implement it.
No, that's a great point. Thank you, Tracy. And it can be a challenging point in the development of a nonprofit organization, right? Because often you start very small and the people who found the organization are wearing all the hats. But exactly as Tracy said, as the organization grows, develops the ability to hire paid staff, the board's role becomes crystally clear. It's one of oversight and not being in the weeds of the day-to-day operations of the organization. So briefly here, Jeff already teased this very important and interesting update that's coming out shortly to Independent Sectors Trust and Civil Society report. The stats on this slide refer to last year's report. We're all going to have to wait a couple of weeks to get the updated numbers for this year. But the numbers here, I think, reflect the fact that while good governance has always been important, it's particularly important right now because we seem to be in a moment when trust in public institutions is declining, and that's a big problem for the nonprofit sector, which relies on government contracts, grants, and individual donations to fund much of its work. For the majority of donors, this report is telling us that trust is no longer a given, right? It's not sufficient that you're doing good work. Nonprofits must earn my trust before I support them, right? 78% of respondents agreed with that statement in last year's report. So you have, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
No, I was just going to sort of foot stomp the point, and again, without, releasing the report before we release the report. It is absolutely consistent, including what we learned in this most recent polling, that this need and this expectation of nonprofits to govern themselves in a way that is transparent and ethical. It is only growing in terms of an expectation and a response to declining trust, a needed response.
Yeah, I mean, that's concerning, but I suppose not surprising given what last year's report told us, right? And so, you know, however you feel about this as someone who works in the sector, right? This is the reality that we're all facing. And so reasons that recipients cited for high trust in nonprofits included the fact that they are regulated and held accountable at multiple levels by government officials. And reasons for low trust in nonprofits include they've heard about scams, stories of mismanaged funds, and general corruption. Unfortunately, right, in the sector, reputation is everything. And, you know, one bad apple can spoil the bunch when it comes to nonprofit trust. And so one of the ways to combat that approach is to demonstrate the good work your organization is doing through the transparency of your finances, of your governing operations, and sort of building your organization as robustly as possible so that you can show as well as actually do the good work. So with that said, I'm going to flip this over to Tracy.
Yeah, so I'm going to sort of cover the basic rules. And before I get into those, I really like this graphic because I think that it's, you know, as always, a picture sort of tells 1,000 words. But these are the things that if you think about, what does it mean to be good governance? And, you know, Courtney touched on some of these with the transparency. As when I was a regulator, I talked a lot about the reason why we existed was not just to go and, you know, go after charities, but to really try to hold them to some of these standards, to be accountable and responsive and transparent, so that, you know, the public not only can have this trust in the sector, which is really very important, but they can, you know, be informed and make good decisions about how they want to spend their money. We're talking about board members spending your time and money, but the donors are out there and, you know, they need to be able to have the same comfort level. So these are all of the things that kind of arise out of the principles of good governance. If you think about themes, and each one of them is really, in my mind, equally important to the other. They all go back into the center and will give you the good governance that you want to achieve. So what are the basic rules? We talk a lot about fiduciary duties, and that's what the basic rules are. The three: duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. I like to say, if I could sum it up on what these three things mean, as a board member, you have to show up, you have to pay attention, and you have to ask questions when you're in those meetings. I've had experience where I've sat on boards, I've been there as the lawyer for the organization, or I've been there as a member myself. And there's a lot of people that you know, they get, unfortunately, and I don't know if it's from when they're recruited to come on or if they just always had this idea, but they come to the meeting, they sit in silence, they never ask a single question, and then they leave. And that to me isn't really showing up and showing your duty of care. So show up, pay attention, ask questions, and then in addition to that, follow the rule of law, but also follow your mission, because that's equally as important, and be loyal. You have to put the needs of the organization over your own. So that's my sort of encapsulation of what those three duties mean. If we go sort of a little bit more into detail, that's what I was talking about with the duty of care. It is important to know that it's one of prudence. You don't have to have a special level of expertise. And frankly, you can also rely on others. So for example, if you have the duty to, you know, invest under the Uniform Prudent Management Act, which thankfully I don't get involved a lot in. There are others in my firm that understand it better than me. But one of the things that I know about that, though, is that not everybody has expertise in investing. So you don't have to come to the table and have legal expertise or investment expertise, but you have to know enough that you can show up and, again, ask questions. And you can go and hire other people that do have that expertise, and then you can rely in good faith on their judgment and their guidance as they're walking you through. For example, me as a lawyer. But you can never take any actions that would not be in the best interest of the organization. Organization always comes first. And it gets tricky because some people will sit on multiple organizations, and then which hat are you wearing and how do you balance all of that? And it does get trickier the more you're involved with more than one organization. The duty of loyalty. Again, this is really important. This is where we talk about conflict of interest. And a lot of the states now require you to go through certain processes to try to eliminate conflicts of interest, or certainly eliminate your active. So let's say you do have a conflict. Conflicted transactions, I always tell people, they're not always bad. You just have to make sure you follow the rules. Sometimes me on a board, I might give pro bono. So that's the best deal that the organization can get for legal services for something. And that's great, but I still have to follow the rules, and I have to not participate in that process of trying to engage me as the lawyer. So again, conflicted transactions, not bad, but you have to follow the rules. The independent members have to be the ones to make the decision to ensure that hiring that person or that organization really is in fact in the best interest of the organization. And lastly, duty of obedience. And as I said at the beginning, this is, you have a couple of things that you have to comply with. You have to ensure when you're engaging in any activity that you're doing it in furtherance of your mission. You might hear from time to time people talk about mission creep, and that happens. If it does, and it's a natural progression from your mission, that's, again, not a bad thing, but you kind of then have to readjust and say, okay, does this make sense of where we are? If you're an organization that is struggling, I say to people all the time, well, what is your core mission? What is the thing that you exist to do? And if we're having trouble, we don't have enough money or whatever, we always have to remember to just make sure to go back to what is our core mission? Why do we exist in the first place? But if you are able to sort of expand on that in natural ways, that makes sense. But then there are things you have to do to go along with that. You might have to change your bylaws. You might have to, maybe update the IRS. There might be some things you have to do if you've gone beyond originally set up to do. You also have to comply with, obviously, your organizational documents, like your charter, bylaws, decisions of the board, which become sort of the law of the organization if it's done properly with resolutions and everything. Or policies, also the law, state and federal laws that might apply to your organization. Those are all rules that you have to follow. I'm in the first part of this, and I'm going to turn to Courtney. I'm going to focus on the state and what those laws are. And there are the nonprofit corporation laws, which set up your standards of conduct that, as I mentioned earlier, they address conflicts of interest and what are the rules that we have to follow. Again, conflicted transactions can happen as long as you follow the rules. Whistleblower protection is extremely important that you're following those. And it gets a little tricky. I worked on a case recently where the client actually was originally incorporated in New York and was in New York forever and ever and ever, and then moved to Pennsylvania. And which law applied? They wanted it to be Pennsylvania because the whistleblower protections in Pennsylvania are not quite as stringent as they are in New York. But because they were incorporated in New York, even though they have no physical presence in New York, we came to the conclusion that New York applied. And it was involving a whistleblower and what kind of protections were going to be in place. And frankly, I would argue that, the whistleblower should get the protection anyway, depending, no matter what law, but certainly New York had some very specific things that had to be followed. Audit oversight as well. There more and more states are coming on board with specific rules and when do they apply. Certainly if you're incorporated in that state, but some of the states' laws also suggest that those laws might apply if you're registering because you're soliciting in that state and you reach certain thresholds. And when you're at those thresholds, the audit rules might apply to you as well. I do spend a lot of my time arguing on, for a foreign corporation, what really does that state, what kind of authority do they have over you, over your governance? And, it's a back and forth, but usually we end up finding a happy medium.
Yeah. So
I'm sorry, I wanted to mention one other thing. A lot of these things now, if you are a charitable organization that's soliciting in states, you have to actually not only as Courtney's going to talk about on the federal forms, a lot of the states will ask, do you have a conflict of interest policy? Do you have a whistleblower policy? And the audit oversight. So it's important that you think about all of these things, even if you're not if you're incorporated in a state that doesn't have all of these specific in their law. If you are soliciting in other states, you might have to think about this anyway. And I frankly, if we're going to do good governance, even if you're not required to do these things, I would argue you should do these things. Sorry,
Yeah,
Courtney.
no, don't apologize. I mean, I think, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking, Tracy, was people get tapped to join nonprofit boards for all kinds of reasons, right? They're a member of the community that the nonprofit serves. They're viewed as a potential donor. They are friends with someone who's already on the board, right? Every board I was ever asked to join is because I had a friend who was already on it. And it can come as a shock, maybe, to think that, regardless of the reason why you're joining the board, once you're there, you have the same responsibilities and obligations as everyone else. And that includes the obligation to get yourself up to speed. Like, this is complicated stuff. And as Tracy noted, with the business judgment rule, there's no expectation that any board member is going to master nonprofit finance and legalities and program and fundraising overnight. But there often is a pretty steep educational curve when you first join a board. And the more your governance practices are well organized and take that reality into consideration, the less daunting it's going to be for your board members when they come on board. And we have some specific tips towards the end of the presentation about educating your board. But it really speaks to the incredible responsibility that's placed on board members' shoulders at nonprofits, again, as volunteers. So it's really an incredible feature of our sector that so many of the important resources and services of our society are, at the end of the day, ultimately stewarded by volunteers who are giving up their time, energy, and knowledge to serve these organizations. Having said that, the law provides a lot of guardrails to keep you on the straight and narrow. And Tracy just talked about some of the ways that manifests in the state nonprofit corporation laws. The federal tax exempt laws are overlaid on top of the state nonprofit corporation laws, right? So if you are, for example, tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, again, the assumption is that most of you are probably working with organizations that are. There are many specific requirements that come with obtaining and maintaining that status. C3 tax exempt organizations must be, quote, organized and operated for purposes that are exclusively charitable, education, religious, scientific. There's a list in the code of the types of activities, purposes, I should say, that qualify an organization for C3 status. If your organization doesn't fall within C3, it might fall within one of the other tax exempt areas of the code. It might be a C4 or a C6 if it's a civic organization. C3s are significant, though, because they're also, not only are they tax exempt, but the donations that people give to the organization are themselves tax deductible to the donor. Those are some very significant financial benefits to being a C3 organization. The trade-off is that they come with significant oversight requirements and compliance requirements. And so two of them are here on the slide. Because the resources of a C3 must be exclusively directed to the fulfillment of those charitable purposes I was just describing, the federal tax law prohibits private benefit, which is a fancy way of saying that the organization's resources must serve a public interest, not a private one. Individuals cannot benefit inappropriately from the organization's resources. Incidental private benefit is generally not a problem, but a substantial amount can cause a C3 organization to lose its tax-exempt status. And then under the heading of private benefit, we have this subset category called private inurement, which is also a problem. And private inurement is private benefit when it's benefiting an individual who's associated with the organization, so one of the insiders. So here you see the intersection between the federal tax law and the fiduciary duties, the state nonprofit corporate statutes that Tracy was just talking about, right? Because we're really talking here about the duty of loyalty, right? If you're a board member on the organization, your duty of loyalty under state corporate law requires you put the interests of the organizations first. If you see a business opportunity that's being offered to the organization and you grab it for yourself, right? Or you inappropriately award yourself excessive compensation for services you're providing to the organization, that's private inurement. That's a problem. And so it can affect board members, but it also more typically involves employees, boards that are not paying attention to the compensation, for example, that the leader of the organization is receiving, the paid staff, the CEO or executive director. And how the IRS monitors all of this, and by extension, many state regulators, is through the Form 990, which is the annual tax return that CA3 organizations file. The assets and revenue of a C3 will determine what type of 990 you file. But organizations that file the longer forms of the 990 are asked not just for financial information, but also many questions about the organization's governance practices, because the IRS has taken the position that well-governed organizations are more likely to comply with their obligations under tax laws and vice versa. Poorly governed organizations are more likely to run into trouble. And so here on the next two slides, we just have some examples of the questions that are asked on the full Form 990 about the organization's governance practices. Do you have a conflict of interest policy? Are you following it? Are board members and key employees filling out annual disclosure forms and updating those on an ongoing basis when conflicts of interest emerge? Do you have a written whistleblower policy, as Tracy noted? Do you have a document retention and destruction policy that lets people know when it's appropriate to destroy documents and when they need to be retained? Line 15 is who is looking at the compensation of the executive director or CEO? Is the board seeking comparables from other organizations of similar size, mission, location, et cetera, to ensure that the compensation it's paying is reasonable? I know for many nonprofits, the idea of being able to pay excessive compensation is not really a risk, right? The concern is often trying to get to a reasonable market rate so that you can attract someone to be the CEO or executive director of your organization. But that we all have seen examples of situations where a CEO or an executive director was receiving an inappropriate level of compensation. And so the 990 asks about that. Moving on, I just want to say here too, has the organization provided a copy of the Form 990 to all of the board members? Very important. Is the board looking at it before filing? And to Tracy's conversation earlier about the fiduciary duties, there are not necessarily so many bad actors in the sector. The issue tends to be more problems with disengaged boards or boards who are asleep at the switch and are not looking at the key documents and are not asking the hard questions. And so these questions on the 990 are meant to nudge the board to looking at the answers prior to filing. This slide just talks briefly about key governance documents to be aware of. So certainly the charter or articles of incorporation, the certificate of incorporation, that's the formation document. That's what was filed to incorporate the organization at the state level. They can be amended. Bylaws follow from the charter. And state nonprofit corporation laws, although not technically a governance document, are listed here because at the end of the day, these trump everything else, right? Your charter and your bylaws need to be compliant with the nonprofit corporation laws of the state in which you were formed. This comes as a shock to some people who have downloaded a very nice set of bylaws from the internet, but have never had them reviewed by legal counsel to ensure that their governance practices are actually sanctioned by their state laws. And some states regulate at a very specific level. So it's a good practice to look at your bylaws from time to time to ensure that they're up to date with the actual practices of the organization and compliant with your state law. And then you have your governance policies, which we've already addressed to some extent. These are just a handful. There are many, many more policies that boards will adopt to manage the work of the organization and govern appropriately. Okay, so now we're going to talk typical governance challenges.
Yep.
Tracy.
So I mentioned earlier that a related party transaction is not necessarily a bad thing. However, it can become a bad thing if it results in self-dealing. And so I did want to sort of clarify that point here. Conflicted transaction could be in the right interest, best interest of the organization. But if it results in self-dealing, so let's say me, the lawyer, I'm on the board, and I decide that I'm gonna well, maybe not lawyer. I have some other kind of work that I do, and you're going to pay me to do it. If it doesn't fall within the allowable kind of work that can be done for the services to the organization, it could result in self-dealing. And self-dealing can be very expensive, not only to the individual who benefited from the self-dealing, but also to the organization itself in the form of excess benefit taxes. Again, not my 100% area of expertise. I have worked on some cases. Those numbers can become pretty staggering if you get involved in a self-dealing transaction. So if you are considering a transaction with somebody who is conflicted with the organization, you want to investigate a little further and make sure that then if you decide, oh, well, that is good for us, make sure it doesn't actually then end up stepping on a self-dealing or private inurement situation, because once you do, you think, oh, no, I want to have this person do this work. That ends up trouble for the organization. In the interest of time, that's all I'm going to say about that.
We could do a whole webinar just on the relationship between the board and the staff, or the board and the executive director or CEO. It is a complex relationship. In the limited time we have available here, I'm going to highlight the third bullet, because I think one of the biggest governance challenges for boards is how to appropriately delegate to staff with oversight, but not tip over into micromanagement or getting involved in day-to-day operational issues that are better and more appropriately handled by staff, and keeping the board's attention on the bigger picture. Sorry, I've skipped too far ahead. Briefly, I think slide 19 actually provides a lot of detail about what we view as the role of the board versus the staff, focusing on the board's role. It's an oversight role, as we've been saying. It's a policy-making role. It's a strategy role. The board, sets the direction, the staff implements. Having said that, the relationship between the CEO, executive director, and the board, right? It's a partnership in some ways. It's also a supervisory relationship. And where you can run into some challenges, right, is where the balance is tipping too much in one direction, right? The board is too involved in the day-to-day operations and not getting out of the way of the staff and letting them do their job. Conversely, the board might be over delegating and under supervising. And in that situation, there are, more opportunity for bad acts to occur. And so there should be processes and policies adapted at the board level that facilitate the healthy operation of the organization, so that the board is getting the kind of reports and information, internal controls, checks and balances that it needs to perform its oversight role. But the staff is not in the position of needing to consult the board on every single decision. And so, again, could do a whole slide on this, a whole webinar on this, but hopefully this provides a little food for thought.
Yeah, I've gotten involved in investigations for organizations where at the crux of that investigation is the relationship between the executive staff and the board, and where that tipping point is. And it's really challenging for organizations that reach that point. So just a few other governance challenges. I personally have been involved with the deceptive and misleading solicitations. We probably should change those words because I don't like them. I've actually successfully argued against that. Deceptive and misleading isn't enough in the solicitations, because they have to be deceptive and misleading with the intention of misleading somebody about what you're trying to say or do with obtaining their money from them and what purposes you're going to use it for. There has to be that intentionality. It's not enough to just accidentally say something wrong and then somebody relied on it to their detriment. And then but still, it's very, very important. And I spend a lot of my time helping clients through looking at their solicitation materials to sort of figure out, are you stepping on some of this concerns about the truthfulness and accuracy of your materials. And administration of assets. And this is where the states are going to come in a lot and care about what's going on. When you see the headlines about, the bad charities and how they're mismanaging their money, this is usually what's at the root of it. And they're going to come out and they're going to find out that usually it came because there wasn't sufficient internal controls, or there wasn't enough people paying attention. Restricted gifts. I spent a lot of time walking through these things with clients, and you can't get loosey-goosey. And actually the restricted gifts relates back up to the solicitations. Even if you don't have a restricted gift instrument itself, if somebody comes to you and asks you for some donation for a specific purpose and you give in response to that, at that moment, it becomes a restricted gift. The solicitation and the response itself becomes sort of the gift instrument, if you will. And so when you are asking for money and you say you're going to do something with that money, you have to do what you said that you would. And then if you can't, it gets tricky on, well, now what do I do? There's a lot of rules and hoops to jump through to get there. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to the basic rules: care, duty of obedience, and duty of loyalty. And all of these things, when you think about it, they all fall within one of those three rules. And so it's just important to always keep that in mind. And one final closing point on this: the states can and will hold board members accountable if they haven't been honoring their fiduciary duties. It has happened even in the fundraising context, certainly in the administration of charitable assets. If you've followed the rules and you've done what you need to do with the rules, the boards are going to be okay. But if you haven't been showing up and paying attention, that's when the boards might also get into trouble.
Folks, I just want to remind, we want to pivot fairly quickly to questions. We have maybe 2 or 3 slides left. Great.
Yep. This I can cover very, very quickly. This is where I actually put the governance, the good governance practices into play. We've actually created some audit documents, legal audit documents using those. I won't read this right now, but this is sort of the highlights of how can we stay out of trouble? How do we audit what we're currently doing? And we have conversations about this. And I think the final slide is
similarly. Yeah, I won't read everything on this slide either, just to say that these are some suggestions for ways you might think about. You might already be doing some of this in your organization. You might not. I think the key takeaway, we hope, of today's presentation is that governance needs to be on your radar screen at all times. And that's a hard thing for boards, right? Because life moves quickly, right? We're all sort of dealing with today's crises, emergencies, reactive to problems. Think about your governance as a proactive thing to do, right? How can we make this better? How can we improve things? How can we provide more opportunities for our board members to understand and learn about their responsibilities and use their time as effectively as possible? The other key I think one of the big takeaways here is training, right? Like providing regular training opportunities, having a standardized board orientation process, thinking critically about your governance nominating committee, if you have one, if you don't have one, that can be a great tool for making sure that the board is thinking about these issues in and amongst all of the daily, weekly, monthly things that keep the board members up at night. And so, and then consulting advisors where appropriate, right? We've thrown a lot of information at you in this presentation, and we've only scratched the surface. Particularly for finance, for legal issues, this is complex, sophisticated stuff. And so reaching out and finding the right people to advise your board when you need it is absolutely a fulfillment of your fiduciary duty, and something more boards should do if they have concerns. So with all of that said, Tracy, unless there's anything you want to add here, or Jeff, I think we can move to questions. Yeah.
Yep.
I just want to piggyback very quickly on the last point you were making, Courtney, which is to say what I have found and I've been doing this for 20 years now. So often organizations don't know what they don't know. And that's where the danger point is. And so coming to webinars like this, going onto state sites and looking for information there, going out there and trying to educate yourself as much as possible is really very critical.
Great. Tracy, Courtney, thank you. We promised time for some questions, so I'm going to kick us off with those that have come in real time and a couple that we got earlier on. So first question, what is the audit committee intended to do?
Do you want to field that, Tracy, or I can do it?
Sure. In the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about it at a very, very high level. The audit committee, the primary purpose of the audit committee is to work with your outside accountants and putting the audit together, your audited financial statements. Every organization has financial statements. Depending upon your level of revenue and contributions, the laws will require that you have them audited by an outside independent accounting firm. I would argue that it's good to do even if you don't meet certain thresholds, but it's very expensive, and I certainly appreciate that. The audit committee's role is to coordinate with the outside accountant. Depending upon how big your organization, the audit committee can be just your full board, but it has to be only independent members of the board. So that's kind of very high level what an audit committee function is.
Thanks, Tracy. So another question, where can you find state nonprofit incorporation laws?
I can field that. So the most relevant one for most nonprofits is going to be the law of the state in which your organization is formed. Google is your friend here if you really want to read the state nonprofit corporation laws. But I echo the point that was previously made. There are lots of maybe more less legalistic, but more helpful layperson resources that you can find through organizations like Independent Sector. Our firm has a blog with all kinds of topics, relevant to the laws that affect nonprofit organizations. National Council of Nonprofits. There are many great resources at the federal, state, and local level that can help you better understand your particular state's laws. The state attorney general in each state is generally the principal regulator for charitable nonprofits, so their website might be a good place to start. Most of them have a section on the site for charities.
Thanks, Courtney.
And just very quickly, the Secretary of State's office is where incorporation happens, and so generally they're going to have the laws there as well.
Great. Courtney, Tracy, thank you. So we've gotten a few questions about executive committees, and I'm going to kind of weave them together as I'm seeing them. So first, a comment or two on the appropriate role of the executive committee, and then a question about setting term limits for board members, and how long should directors, board members actually sit on the executive committee? So kind of a bundle there.
Courtney, how about I do the term limit question, you do the executive committee question?
Sure, yeah.
So there's no hard and fast rule about term limits. I'm an advocate for them because they definitely help with sort of keeping fresh people coming on the board, but at the same time, recognizing that you want to have them long enough, and maybe you definitely want to have them overlap. You want to have staggering terms, so you don't want everybody going on and off the board all at the same time. So you definitely want to have it structured that you have, if just to make it easy, if you have 12 board members, have 4 of them serve for a certain period of time, and 4 and 4, so that you keep that institutional knowledge going forward. But you definitely want to try to bring in fresh blood. I'm an advocate that if you reach your term limit, you can roll off and then you can come back on if the board votes you back on. Then maybe you want to limit that as well. But I think term limits are important, and I think that they can be used really well to make sure that the organization continues to think about new things and move forward.
Yeah, and so an executive committee is generally comprised of the officers. So typically there's a president, a vice president, or a chair, a vice chair, secretary of treasurer. There may be a few other board members on the executive committee who have particular expertise that's relevant, but if your governance documents, particularly your bylaws, stipulate, or even if they're silent, right? But often your bylaws will say, there shall be an executive committee, or there may be a separate charter, right, forming the committee, and will sort of I should say, outline the authority of the committee. Many organizations use the executive committee to handle board level issues that come up in between meetings that don't necessarily require the discussion and vote of the entire board. And so that's why having sort of a carefully crafted committee charter or provisions in your bylaws that stipulate who's on the executive committee, what authority they have to act for the entire board, and how they report back to the rest of the board on the actions they've taken. They can be extremely helpful tools, right? Particularly if you have larger boards that don't meet every month or every 2 months. But like everything else, they need to have clear parameters, and there needs to be a reporting mechanism so that the entire board is aware of what they are doing.
Great. I can tell you last week I was in a conversation on a nonprofit board that I sit on, and we were talking about this very thing. Should we set up an executive committee? What is it supposed to do? IRS has a sample conflict of interest policy. Do you all think it's adequate?
Well, I'm going to give a lawyer answer to that one. It depends. Um, it depends on what state you're in and what that state requires. Some states have much more robust requirements, and so I would certainly first go to the state that you're in, that you were incorporated in, particularly a state like New York, which has extremely robust requirements for all of these things, and ensure that you are complying with that. If there isn't anything specific in the law about it, then for sure the IRS policy would definitely serve.
Anything to add, Courtney?
Nope, co-signed.
Great. Pivoting to a slightly different question about board composition, right? As we're nonprofit leaders and we're thinking about who we put on the board, how do we ensure that board members have the expertise needed to provide both strategic and fiduciary oversight for the organization? I mean, that's a hard thing to do. How do we do it well?
Yeah, I'll go first, Tracy, and then you feel free to jump in here. I think this again is actually we're having like a group of people, a committee that's thinking about governance and nominating can be very helpful because it really does take intentional thought to recruit new board members and then to give them the tools that they need to succeed in the responsibilities that they've undertaken. And so I think that as I said earlier, I think training should be a routine part of every nonprofit board's experience that can come in a variety of ways. Finance daunts a lot of people, and I will say that I think the boards that I've seen are most successful at this have somebody in the treasurer role who is a good teacher, who's willing to take the time to provide an overview every year, sort of about what are the key financial documents that we look at, what should you be looking for when you're reading a financial statement, just sort of a baseline introduction to finance, because that is the skill set I think that most boards struggle with recruiting and training on. And it is one of the reasons why term limits can cut in the other direction, right? Because some types of specialized knowledge can be very difficult to recruit and retain to your board. And so that's one of the, it depends questions, what's right for your organization in terms of how strictly you want to sort of rotate people on and off the board and what you gain and lose in those decisions. But I think board retreats can be helpful, educational opportunities, making board members aware of resources, and just doing as much as you can to sort of document, I think is helpful too, so that you're not reinventing the wheel every time a new board member is being recruited or joining. But there's, over time, you're not going to do this all overnight, but over time, you'll have resources that make it easier for your board members to meet their fiduciary and strategic obligations.
And if I can just add, before they even get on the board and you think about how to train them, which I think is really important, and a board book that you have ready to give to new board members coming on is really important, that has all the important information. But the nominating committee is such an important committee for an organization to think about, and there should be a plan, some strategy on who do we want on our board. So often, you might have an organization that was started because of some tragedy, and everybody, feels like we want to make sure we have the constituents that understand. But then what you sacrifice is people that have all the other expertise that needs to come on. But then on the other hand, you might have a board that's fully comprised of lawyers and accountants, and then you lose the important part of the board where you're able to touch on the mission and the, what you're trying to reach with the organization and what you're doing. So thinking very carefully about and being intentional in who you want to bring onto your board is really important.
Great. I'm going to combine two questions. So the first being, we're currently rewriting our policies, and our director wants to be involved in the process. I assume our executive director. Should we stay clear of the director's involvement in that activity? And then the second piece of the question, any advice or best practice for CEO annual reviews as part of good governance practice?
Well, first of
Um,
all, can I just say I have an annual review. So often I find that organizations don't engage in that at all. They forget that they're actually the boss, if I may, of the CEO, and to review the performance with that CEO, what went, just like you do any of your other employees, what went well, what didn't go well, set the expectations for what you want from that CEO. It's really critically important that you actually engage in that activity every year. I'm sorry, Courtney, I cut you off as you were starting.
no, but I think that's a really important point, right? Just having a review is a important step in the right direction, right? And it's important for the leader of your organization too, right? They should have goals. The board should be invested in their development as a leader too, right? The CEO's success is the organization's success. So annual reviews should not be viewed as a punitive measure, but like an opportunity for the board or the board chair or personnel committee, some subset of the board, to really sit and work with the CEO every year to think about the goals of the organization, their own personal goals, and sort of, the performance metrics that are important. I, I will say, as somebody who works with a lot of executive directors and board members on policy writing, that I think as a general rule, I don't see an issue in staff being involved in the drafting of governance policies as a practical matter. They're often the people who are available to meet with the lawyer during business hours. But you cannot delegate it entirely to a staff person and then just have the board rubber stamp it at the next meeting. That I don't think is a good idea. There should be at least one person on the board who's being deputized to work with the executive director and outside advisor, if you're working with somebody, on the development of these policies, who can be the messenger to the rest of the board and is looking at those policies through the lens of the board member. But I actually think it can benefit the writing of the policies if you have both perspectives, the staff and the board, looking in on their development, because the most important thing is that they're workable for the organization in addition to being legally compliant. And there's no value in a policy that can actually be implemented. So.
Thank you, Courtney. I think we've got 1 minute left for one last question, and then we'll close up. So hopefully we can be quick with this. Is it important to have insurance for board members? What kind of insurance, if any, is generally used?
I mean, I personally, from what I've seen, absolutely 100%, there should be D&O insurance. I would never serve on a board that didn't have D&O insurance available to me. Certainly a board
can, and officers, D&O.
Yes, I'm sorry. D&O is directors and officers insurance, which is what we're talking about here. And I think it's critically important to have that in place. Again, back to a board is protected as long as you are fulfilling your duties, but sometimes you can still get caught up in some challenges for the organization, and having that insurance in place is really important. I would also relatedly look and see what the indemnification provisions are for your organization, so that if someone is acting appropriately and properly and in the best interest of the organization, the board can say, under certain circumstances, we will protect you, basically, we'll indemnify you if you get into trouble as a result of something that came about with the organization getting into trouble. So insurance and indemnification are two important things. And if you're considering going on to a board, you should always ask questions about both of those.
Yeah, I just want to add one important footnote to that, which is to say that if you are on the board of an organization that has employees, you should verify with your broker that whatever policy you're buying has employment practices liability insurance. Because in practice, the biggest risk for lawsuits against directors comes from people who claim they were inappropriately treated as employees. And so that is its own coverage. It's often a subset of a D&O policy, directors and officers, as Jeff mentioned, or you could buy it separately. But that should be part of the consideration as well.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Tracy. We are about 2 minutes out, and so I want to close the question period and just kind of recap a couple of things. First of all, again, a big thank you to Perlman Perlman, to Courtney, and to Tracy. And I want to foot stomp, right? Trust is our currency as a sector. There is nothing we do that doesn't get harder or impossible if trust is declining. And you have, as board members, as executive directors, C-suite, wherever you sit in the organization, you've got a critically important role to play in making sure that your organization is setting good governance practice and taking those practices seriously. Again, independent sector invites you to be a part of ongoing conversations around trust, the health of our sector, and good governance. There are a couple of ways specifically that you can do that. Again, on the 27th of September, we will be hosting a webinar with Edelman Data and Intelligence and a few other sector leaders regarding the latest report that we release on the 26th on trust in the sector. And if you've not had the opportunity yet, please do go to upswell.org. Upswell.org. You can also get to Upswell by way of the IS website, and consider registering for our annual conference this year in Dallas in person, November 15 to 17. If you join us at Upswell, you'll have another opportunity to engage in conversation with your peers in the sector, with organizations like Perlman Perlman and others, and with independent sector staff, as together we contemplate the next iteration of the policy, of the principles, of good governance and ethical conduct. We're thinking about stepping into a refresh in 2024, and we'd love to have your input as we frame that work. Two last points. This webinar has been recorded and it will be made available to you. And there is a survey that we ask that you complete. This is how we actually learn whether or not we're giving you the information you most need and how we can improve in the delivery of these kinds of webinars. So please do take the time to complete that survey. Again, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you on the 27th of September and maybe even in Dallas. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.